A warm embrace and a cold shower. The German Chancellor's trip to Brazil was more of a roller coaster ride than expected. Olaf Scholz traveled to the South American country to welcome it and its new president back on the world stage after his predecessor had alienated many of Brazil's Western partners. But it won't all be smooth sailing with Lula da Silva either, and he made that very clear. Asked to provide military support to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia's invasion, Lula said he doesn't want any involvement in the war. Instead, Lula said Brazil and China could play a role in peace negotiations. Scholz was hoping to rally Lula's support in providing ammunition for German-made tanks in Ukraine. The Brazilian president refused to side with the West and reiterated that, in his view, Russia and Ukraine were equally to blame for the war.
It can't be possible in the 21st century that we're seeing a war and we don't even know why it exists. Some say it's because of NATO, some say it's because of entry to the European Union, some say it's about the territory that Russia occupies. There needs to be someone at the negotiating table, and I think that our Chinese friends have an important role to play. If I go to China in March as planned, that is an issue I want to discuss with President Xi Jinping. It's time for China to get involved and to try and help find peace between Russia and Ukraine.
Let's bring in Valentina Sauter. She's the Associate Director and Brazil Lead at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Ms. Sauter, welcome to the day. So Olaf Scholz traveled to Brasilia to welcome Brazil back into the international fold, but it seems like Lula isn't about to dance to the West's tune, is he?
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Well, I think that this is something, it's a position that Brazil has in terms of really looking for this diplomatic means through which we find a peaceful negotiation to the war on Ukraine. And I think that Lula, as expected from Brazil's diplomacy, has chosen to take this stance as well in terms of not really moving in any direction, in terms of taking a very strong stance in terms of, providing the tools to make to help with the war in terms of what the Germany has been asking, in terms of the West has been asking. So I think that what Lula is proposing is this peaceful negotiation to the war, which is something that is aligned with Brazilian diplomacy in general.
So Brazil, of course, maintains important ties to Russia. And in the past, Lula, who was president before, has called Putin a great and dear friend. Was it naive of Germany to expect military support from the country? Did Olaf Scholz know that he wasn't going to get any when he traveled to Brazil? What do you think?
To me, honestly, it wasn't surprising that Lula didn't agree with such a direct contribution to the war in this sense. I think that it's very much aligned with what we would have expected from Lula in the past, in his past two terms, as well as with Brazilian diplomacy in general, to have this pro-peaceful negotiations through diplomatic means as a resolution to this war on Ukraine. So I think that this is what we are seeing also in terms of how Brazil and Russia have had long-standing diplomatic relationships. So Brazil has had so with Ukraine as well. But in a way, there are also multilateral fronts in which both countries, Brazil and Russia, agree on and also collaborate on in terms of the BRICS and the G20, as well as the UN, which is also a way there in which Brazil is bringing back its position in the world stage.
Yeah. Lula said that it looked to him like Russia had made the classic mistake, and this is a quote, of invading another country's territory, and somehow that it took two to tango, shifting the blame towards Ukraine, too, for not sitting down or not agreeing to the terms that Russia might be imposing on them to achieve peace. What does that tell us about Lula's view of the conflict?
I think it shows us that Lula is really pushing again for this peaceful negotiation, that both sides should be willing to have a negotiation and actually discuss the means in which we could agree to have a resolution to this conflict. And I think it's also a point in which Lula brings in also the fact that the UN and the UN Security Council, which is an interesting of Lula himself and of Brazil in this sense, is bringing back this question of the UN Security Council not really representing the geopolitics of the day, of today. So this
Yeah.
is something that is important that Lula, back in his 2 terms in office, has also proposed a reform of the UN Security Council to bring in Brazil, for example, as a member of the UN Security Council for these negotiations, and a reason why maybe Lula is bringing in China as part of this peaceful conversations.
Let's look at China because, you know, we've seen this shifting the blame away from Russia, a common practice, not only among the BRICS countries, but also among the BRICS countries. You know, Russia is one of them, and they are close allies, the entire group. Yesterday, China, who's yet to condemn the war, went a step further and directly pointed the finger at the U.S. Let's listen in and then get back to you.
As the ones who started the Ukraine crisis and the biggest hand fueling the conflict, the U.S. continues to send heavy weapons, prolonging and intensifying the conflict. If the U.S. truly hopes for an early end to the crisis and really cares about the safety of Ukrainian people's lives, it should cease sending weapons for war profiteering. It should work responsibly to de-escalate the situation and create a favorable environment for peace talks.
So the U.S. there being accused of fanning the flames of war, is that a sentiment shared by Brazil?
Think necessarily that deep is a sentiment that is shared, but honestly, it seems to me that there is an alignment in terms of the language that is being used, in terms of really pushing for these peaceful negotiations, and not only calling on Russia not to have a part to blame, because it does, and I think that Lula was clear in saying that Russia made a mistake in invading Ukraine, but also to make sure that there is a pressure added there for both Putin and Zelensky to be ready to sit at the negotiating table and actually talk about what peace might look like for both countries. And I think in a way, a push by these non-allied countries to actually push the West as well as the United States in helping achieve that end result, which would be peace.
Are they really not allied, though? Or are they somewhat closer to Russia than to the rest of the countries?
No, I really think that there is a take for both. Honestly, there is an alignment with the United States in general, normally more to the West than to Russia. In terms of commerce, for example, in terms of trade, Brazil is way more aligned with the United States than with Russia, but both represent an important partner, important strategic partners for Brazil in terms of geopolitics in general and world politics. So I think that there is more to be looked at into this in this stance than just U.S. versus Russia situation or China versus U.S. situation.
So what Lula proposes is a peace initiative led by Brazil and with Chinese involvement. China has so far been fairly reluctant to get involved in any way. So what leverage does Lula have to change that? Because he's going there in March and he says that he wants to bring up the topic.
Yes, so Lula in a way has that in, right? Lula is, the expectation for the Lula administration nowadays is very high. Everyone is expecting Lula to, again, bring Brazil back into the international community and really push for these kinds of peaceful negotiations. Brazil, and Lula particularly, has a history in terms of negotiating with Iran as well. So this is maybe a way in for giving a chance to the Lula administration and for Lula himself to try to make this a possibility, like bring this narrative and this rhetoric to China as he visits China in March, and then also to the United States as he comes to meet with Biden now in February.
Valentina Satter of the Atlantic Council, thanks a lot for those insights.
Thank you.